Intimidation or bullying at work can have the same physiological response as a lion or as a physical threat. Somebody's going to get near you to punch you.
Welcome to the Circuit Magazine, the #1 source of information on protection matters, the industry-leading magazine for all security professionals who want to stay ahead of the game.
Security culture and mental well-being. Today, we're very pleased to be speaking with Jon Rodriguez, founder of Empathic Security Cultures and an illustrious history in corporate security. I'm here with Shaun West. Why do you think these two topics should go together? Security culture, but also mental well-being.
Hi, Pelham. Well, I think first of all, it's great to have Jon on the podcast. I mean, he's got a huge amount of experience working for lots of multinational corporations, including Kimberly, Cardinal Health, amongst many others. But the subject we're talking about, security culture and mental well-being, are huge topics at the moment. And I think, I've worked in many different organizations myself where you go somewhere and when you're talking security culture, you can look at the staff, and if the staff aren't under good terms and conditions, they aren't treated well, they aren't feeling valued for the work that they provide, the security culture that they have dips considerably. And once you're looking after the staff, as that dips, you've got guys and girls there who are there, maybe they're providing a token effort of service, not the service that the client is paying for. So I think in any organisation, it works well to go in there and treat your staff as you expect to be treated yourself. And, that will make a whole difference. If everything's warm, fluffy there, being looked after, then people who are working there want to be there and want to provide the good service that they're being asked to provide.
Absolutely, and that will pay dividends, isn't it? Because you invest in your staff, you invest in the organization, and some people talk about it like morale, but I think it's deeper than morale. In that morale covers a multitude of things, both happy and not so much happy. But in terms of culture, I think this is kind of interesting for the EP community, because imagine you are a private, smaller EP operating group, or maybe you're an individual. The way in which you fit in with someone else's culture, the way you influence culture. Do you think it's even possible, unless you're in a really big corporate entity? Do you think like the solo operator has any influence on security culture here?
Yeah, I think certainly if you're bringing, someone who's well respected and well versed in the security industry and going into an organisation, they can certainly professionalise the operation after having a look at it and, help promote that security culture. I mean, you have different cultures within the security teams. I mean, when you have EP teams, you have the residential security teams, CCTV operators, and, they all work offer different facets of security. They should all be working towards one common goal. And when you get the he said, she said, they're on these terms and conditions, these are on theirs, it can create a bit of them and us culture sometimes. So it's nice getting a good leader, good manager who can come in and help wrap their arms around everything and bring everyone pulling in the same direction.
Love that. And that sort of gels even with some of the earlier podcast episodes we did with Simeon Rosset, and saying, the butler is part of the RST team, bring him on board, keep him in a nice cohesive culture. But yeah, this very, very timely, and obviously in the run up to the festive period, empathic security cultures, that's Jon's venture. I think that gels with mental well-being and the importance of the protectors, particularly over this time, because it's not all plain sailing for all operators, and I think it's good that we address that. So let's get into it with Jon Rodriguez, a big friend of the industry, and we'll look at security culture, but also mental well-being.
And now, let's meet one of the contributors to the Circuit Magazine.
mental health and security culture. Today, Jon Moss and myself are delighted to be welcoming Jon Rodriguez, founder of Empathic Security Cultures. It's a pleasure to have you on the Circuit Magazine podcast. How are you doing?
Good morning, Phelan, or good day, John, as well. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on, and I love doing these thematic podcasts where we explore something applicable to the protector. So, why is mental health and security culture blended together as a topic? What are we trying to explore here?
Sure. Well, a lot of folks are looking at COVID as an eye-opener or a starting point or a emphasis to look more at mental health. But, my philosophy over 40 years and my exposure and my experience is that it's been around forever, just like physical health. And I think folks in the security industry have a great opportunity to learn more about it and understand their own mental health and how mental health drives business success at any size of the company. And it drives several other things, not just business success in the sense of degree or range of profitability, turnover, presenteeism. You've heard of the term presenteeism. Folks may be dealing with a mental health issue themselves or their loved one, and they're at work doing their job, but part of them is focused on their loved one or their own condition. It may be diagnosed or undiagnosed. We're all on the mental health spectrum. We all have ups and downs. Anxiety is good in a way, but severe or clinical anxiety or depression, is outside that norm, and that's different for everybody. So I think us in the profession have like I mentioned, a really incredible opportunity, but you have to start with vulnerability and honesty with yourself. And I think ego drives that. And a lot of folks in the industry that have come out of certain previous disciplines or career they have the mindset or the bias that they have to be the protector, the guard, the agent, whatever you want to call it. And yet they're not honest with their own vulnerability. I mean, it's just like physical health. No one has an issue going for their annual physical, right? And if there's something wrong, most people do something about it.
And so obviously we're delighted to have you on, and we know your backstory. But for the benefit of our listeners, where does your passion for this come from?
I think I've always had it, and I think and that's why I named my company Empathic, based on empathy and compassion. I think it's innate to some degree, but it's also how you're raised by your parents. And my mother was very compassionate with the needy and the poor, and anybody that just needed a friend to listen to. And empathy is based on setting your ego aside, clearing your mind, and really being engaged with someone else and understanding, what they're going through in their life. And that, if you can achieve that, it'll help you be a better person, and it'll help you build, if you're a security professional, it'll help you better understand that connecting with every person from the third shift janitor to the manager to the director, VP, senior, CEO, C-suite, if you can connect with folks on that vulnerable level of wanting to connect with them, in the investigative field, they talk about establishing rapport when you first interview somebody, right? And we can jump. I'm going to weave through things, and hopefully I'll circle back to the point and to your question. But conducting corporate investigations, the people are taught to establish that rapport. Well, I take it a lot further, and I say when I teach folks and mentor folks, it's not rapport, it's connection, because you don't want to just connect with the person in that vulnerable moment that you're interviewing them, but you want them to be an advocate for your security culture after you leave. So the focus of, I think, mental health starts with our own mental health. And if we can be true to ourselves, maybe you're on that spectrum, and we all have our ups and downs, and maybe you're fine, but you've read, and there's studies by different agencies and recognized authorities that before COVID, it was 1 in 5 or 20% of folks had or will have a mental health diagnosis in their life. After COVID, I read some reports that it's gone up to 1 in 4. So any company that has an operation anywhere in the world, we're a snapshot of the community that we're in. So, it's safe to say that some percentage of your workforce is dealing with mental health, either a diagnosis or a condition that they're dealing with, or the other group. Now, that 1 in 4 and 1 in 5, most professionals in the mental health industry agree on that. The number I've been searching for is, what's the number of folks that have loved ones that have had a diagnosis, or they think they might have a condition, and they're very focused. They love them. They want to take care of them. They're preoccupied. They worry about them, and it affects that person or that employee or that security professional. And it could cause a condition within themselves based on the relationship they have with someone else. So I always promote that folks take care of their mental health and be vulnerable. I mean, the stigma barrier is the main thing for folks to get over or get through, to seek help and to be honest with themselves. And it's sad, especially the security professionals, folks that came out, like I said, different previous careers, that, they might think that's a sign of weakness, and it's not.
And that really chimes a lot with a lot of the different sessions we've had this past year, because we've had a session on Elijah's short circuit, which is another component of our podcast, where we talk about, well, what happens when you're on the job and something at home is happening. How do you manage that? We talk about workplace violence, victims and candidates, within an organization. Not all incidents are as clear cut as they might first look. And of course, going into this interesting, uncertain time of economic change, then it could do unforetold things. Usually it's at this point I'd say, what do you want the uninitiated to know? But I think we can skip that, because honestly, I think everyone has some appreciation for either being in a degree of misfortune, or knowing someone else. So I'm going to go direct to Jon, and we can jump into it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you should say that, Paul. I'm actually skipping that particular question, because while I think you're right, we all have our own experiences, and we can all pretty much relate to something, probably, in our own lives, our family, or our work experience to date that touches on this issue. However, I still think, particularly in the security industry, and as Jon alluded to already, we do lag behind a bit. And, when you hear stats like that, 25%, of all people will suffer with some form of mental health issue in their life, I really feel like this is an area, that can't be ignored anymore, can't be brushed under the carpet. And it's great that we've got Jon on, with his 40 years experience. And I guess what I'd like to ask, right off the bat, is what are the challenges that you've seen, the obstacles that you've seen managers, companies, institutions put up to prevent a dialogue, to prevent us seeing advancement in mental health and the kind of leadership and support that's required to deal with these issues in the security industry when we compare it to other industries?
Great question. And that goes over to the security culture piece, which it takes time and timing to develop those relationships with business leaders. And when I teach or mentor on security cultures, I talk about every company has their corporate culture, and your security culture sits on that. And I also talk about there's really three subcultures in a corporation. The C-suite level, they're at headquarters, they establish what the company's going to do or not do. Then you have your regional, your EMEA, your APAC, your LATAM group president, for example, or senior leader there. And then you have the site leader. If it's an office, if it's a warehouse, manufacturing, whatever it is, each of those three influence your security culture. And basically that means the importance they place on protecting the employees first and putting people first in a compassionate way. So to your question, if you can work with all three of those, especially the site leadership team, because they're on the front line too. You mentioned workplace violence, and though it's a US centric historical phenomenon going on for 40 years, I remember when I started my career, the going postal was literally folks, postal workers committing acts, right? So I've lived through all that, and I've learned through hard knocks, through great mentors, through information, and I want to pass that on. I think in the rest of the world, it says, US, that's your problem. Well, it's not, because you get into the psychological safety area, and that is how we treat each other, and the bullying aspect. I would say in the UK or whatever country your listeners are in, you have a high degree of bullying. I'd feel comfortable in saying that, unless the culture is established that we have a respectful workplace where there's no profanity, there's no raising your voice, that we take care of each other. You might not like somebody, but when we're at work, we treat each other with dignity and respect. So those are all different components to reaching that goal. So entering a discussion with a leader, if you have that rapport and that trust, and that security culture is complex, but it's doable. And I hope folks look at it differently and not just say it's awareness training or somebody's assigned a security culture where they read a book and they think that that's it. That's scratching the surface, I think. If you have a rapport with a site director, for example, and you have bullying or a workplace violence incident, if you have that discussion with the leader and say, we ought to look at mental health as a component, and there's been studies and books and different perspectives that people don't snap, there's indicators and behaviors, and I agree with that. But I also agree with when folks do act out, and maybe it's just bullying, from being a bully that day to actually committing violence, they're mentally unwell or something's going on in their life, stressors in their life that day, maybe, whatever, their spouse or their child or their car broke down, and they come into work in a bad day, and somebody asks them to help them with something, and they raise their voice or they close the space in a threatening way. That's emotional, that's mental health. So a leader, if you tell the story the right way and give them empirical data, and even before that, team with HR, and if you have a benefits department, HR usually sits within that group. And employees that are fortunate to work with a company that have employee assistance programs, resources or benefits to access mental health professionals, telling the story to the site leaders that we need to normalize mental health and do more in promoting the EAP benefits, and maybe bringing in a speaker, doing different innovative things. One of the things that I promote is in the US, the local law enforcement agencies have something called CIT officers, crisis intervention trained officers, and they're trained to deal with mental health crisis, right? So you can reach out to them and invite them into your workplace to do a talk on mental health. Just like you can invite them in to do a talk on workplace violence, or use the facilities to practice with their, their profession. So the key is you can't do it on your own. A security professional cannot mandate a security culture. The leaders of the company do, but their focus is making and selling stuff, right? And that's great. You want them to trust you, and that takes time and timing and opportunity and incidents where you can go in and prove that you're capable, and you give good guidance. You go in and do a good investigation, that before you leave, the good culture at that site is left intact. I've seen guys come in that are retired law enforcement, and they'll pull out their retired card, their credential, it's perforated, and say, you know who I am? I'm law enforcement, and my buddy's the chief of police. It scares the heck out of the person. They may go in and solve the issue and get their, get the bad guy. Even the word bad guy, I mean, it's so complex that you're setting yourself as a different person than an ally, as a compassionate co-worker, that you work for the company just like they do. I don't even say I'm from global security. I work with HR. I'm here to look into something versus I'm here to investigate something. So, and I know I'm jumping all over the place. The security professional can drive the culture, but they're not going to be successful on their own. Everybody in the department has to understand what it takes. And it takes a long time. It takes one opportunity, one interaction, one incident, one event at a time. But getting back to mental health, if you can get that site leader and maybe their regional VP to say, that makes sense, I do want to talk more about mental health. And they're the authority, they're the leader. People look at them for guidance. They look at what they do and say. So if you have the right way to talk about mental health, and the key to that is vulnerability. I have a family member that was diagnosed with a condition several years ago, and I went full circle through all the emotions, and I found the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org, and they were a lifesaver. One of the things they had was small group discussions, and they had it for the two groups. The group that I mentioned that have a diagnosis, where they get together in small groups, 10 to 12 people, and the family support group for the ones that have loved ones that are dealing with a challenge. And you get together. Before COVID, we got together in person. Now it's virtual, but you all have to agree that what's said there stays there. And there's two facilitators. I eventually got certified to lead the discussions. I'm based out of Austin, Texas. So the two facilitators, it's a two-person team. We start out that small group discussion by telling our stories of our loved ones or how it impacted us. And we're very, very transparent. And some of the stories will make you cry, and they're heartbreaking. And I've cried with the groups, and I've been there in an empathic way and compassionate way. So I took that model to my last company, and I talked to some site leaders and the HR senior leaders and the benefits folks who were familiar with NAMI, with the model. And I said, let me try. I want to come into some sites and ask the employees if they would. It's a two-part effort. One, get all the employees together in small groups. And that works better for a facility, manufacturing site. They can't pull everybody off the floor, but you can do 10 sessions of 30 minutes in 12 hours, where we go in and I would focus on mental health, and I would just ask them to listen, and I would tell my story, and you could hear pins drop. And one of the most proudest moments I ever had is somebody afterwards came up and said, I worked here 30 years. This is the first time somebody spoke to me, not at me. And it was wonderful. So if you show that vulnerability, and if you can find somebody at that work, a peer there that may be willing to share their vulnerability in a group, then during that discussion, you'll say, tomorrow I'll be here again. We're going to do some small group discussions, totally voluntary. You don't have to go, show up if you want, but we're going to talk about your stories in a confidential, open way. And that's, I think, one of the best ways to break through that stigma barrier.
Yeah, it's great to hear that, Jon. It's great to hear about the wins and celebrate the victories as much as, we can sit here and unpick everything that's wrong and where the problems lie. So it's great to celebrate those victories. And there's so much to unpack in all of that. But I kind of want to go back to, I think, this idea of the security culture, the core theme, and how it goes hand in hand with mental health. Because one of the things I was reflecting on there as I was hearing you talk is what's my relationship to the term, the security culture. And it's something, that we often hear, but probably unless you're, higher up in one of those, higher echelons that you mentioned at the C-suite or regional, then maybe it's not something you're going to think about, too much. Certainly, I'm speaking for myself here. You don't necessarily understand what your role is in affecting the security culture. You probably certainly don't feel like it's down to you or you're responsible for it. But what I heard coming through that is leadership. It's all about leadership. And that's something, even at the lowest level in the industry, because a lot of responsibility rests on the individual shoulders. Leadership is something we can all connect with. And so therefore, when we're trying to diagnose problems, is it as simple as coming down to leadership problems, or is that oversimplifying it?
Well, I think before leadership is compassion and respect and treating people fairly. And that kind of moves into the psychological safety component, which is a whole different topic. There's neuroscientists that have established that we have a threat response and a reward response, and intimidation or bullying at work can have the same physiological response as a lion or as a physical threat. Somebody's going to get near you to punch you. And that's been proven by the technology that they have to monitor the brain responses. So, and one of the best ones is the Neuro Leadership Institute, Dr. David Rock, and his model is called the SCARF model. And his basis is SCARF is an acronym for status, certainty, relatedness, fairness, and autonomy. And we want all those things at work, especially. We want the autonomy you tell me how to do my job. I don't need a micromanager. Give me the freedom to prove that I can do my job. Status, whatever I do, if it's a forklift driver or a mechanic or electrical, my status at work is important. And that all goes to mental health. Certainty. We want to make sure that the doors lock, and that maybe our site's in a high crime area, and that security has gates that work versus some that don't work. Because if at the end of the day, what we want from a security culture is information. What do we want for employees? To trust leadership based on the relationship that they've had over time, credibility, fairness, and respect. And that goes to the Great Place to Work Institute model. It's very simple. And it's all based on trust. If employees trust leadership, and if leadership comes with security and talks about things that we want them to be aware of, you talk about security awareness. I don't call it security awareness. I call it security requests. Because really, at the end of the day, you can go and have a funny video, a long video, a short video, a blast, anything. But if the employees don't trust you, what's the probability that they're going to do what you ask them to do? So to simplify a security culture from a security department, what do we want? We want information of wrongdoing. Somebody's a bully. Somebody's offering to sell drugs. Somebody's asking to buy drugs. Somebody tailgated or piggybacked at my car coming in, or I saw some suspicious people in the parking lot. We want those bits of information, or the card reader's not working, the door closer's not closing. All those things, if we ask the employees to tell us, the sooner we know, just like workplace violence, when we have those behavioral changes, those indicators, the sooner the company knows their threat response team can start taking action to address the risk. So that's where time and timing comes in, right? And it comes on trust. So again, you can talk to employees till they're blue in the face, but unless they trust you or trust the leadership, and maybe you too, as a security professional, if you've been in there 6 months ago and you did an investigation and you were rude or disrespectful to people, they're going to remember you. And maybe you interviewed 5 people and you were not very kind. You can be kind and still resolve the issue. After you leave, those 5 people are going to tell everybody else, I got interviewed. You know, that affects their status and their certainty, and it affects their psychological safety balance. Everybody wants to have homeostasis and have know what's going to happen that day. I'm going to go to work. I'm going to do this, and I'm not going to have a bully breathing down my back. I'm not going to have a leader cussing, using profanity, throwing the keyboard against the wall. You know, just a number of bullying effects. So I've jumped to psychological safety, to mental health, to security culture, to relationships with leaders, and I hope I'm making sense. So I'll stop right there.
Yeah, no, that's great, Jon. I mean, what you're saying there as well, you know, those are the things that will create the conditions to allow for the vulnerability that you spoke about earlier. And so I guess I wanted to move for our listeners. You know, we've got listeners at, you know, every stage of their career. And I'm thinking about, you know, at some point, and to some degree, we're all leaders. Like I said about the, you know, the devolved levels of responsibility that we all carry on our shoulders. And you know, that level of responsibility typically only increases the longer you stay in the industry. And so with that said, what one piece of advice would you give to any leaders, anyone listening to this now? What can they start doing practically to create those conditions that will allow for the support and trust required to create that security culture?
I think start learning about security culture, but be careful where you seek that wisdom. You know, I don't know everything, but I was laughing with one of my folks that I mentor, and I say, you know, remember the Matrix movie, the first one, where Neo, they sat him in the chair and they stuck that probe in and they downloaded Kung Fu, right? And he said, I know Kung Fu. So I would love to convey my 40 years of, I call it wisdom, because I failed a lot, and I have the battle scars with leaders who didn't care for security, but you have to have the courage to run towards them. You know, it's easy to find, and I always talk about in business leadership, you have folks that really support the security function. They see the value. You have the folks that are in the middle that have good and bad experiences. And then you have business leaders that have no use for security. They see them as a total CapEx or OpEx drain because you don't have that relationship with them and you don't talk to them in a business sense. You know, and one of the tools or strategies I use to do that is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Most of the business leaders in their studies, the ones that went to school, maybe got a business or accounting or finance degree, they probably took an elective in psychology, and they might have studied Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you remember, the second need before they can feel belonging and loving and self-actualization, which we want, which impacts employee retention, employee engagement, effort, commitment, trust, and all those things, we have to provide a safe and secure workplace for the employees to feel real security and perceived security. Okay. So if you approach a business leader, and I've given talks to conferences where senior leaders are there, and I start with the Maslow hierarchy of needs because they remember that, and that's not disputable. And the second story I tell is when I worked for Kimberly Clark, we were rated number one out of 1,900 companies by the Great Place to Work Institute, which you may be familiar with. And I would tell the listeners to research what that's about. They have a really great model that I mentioned, trust, based on 3 pillars: trust, credibility, and fairness. Well, my security strategies with the senior leader, the group president for that region, who was one of the ones that hated security because they thought we were only reactive corporate cops, and he didn't want anything to do with us. It took several years to change his perception, which cascaded down to the country, 22 country managers in Latin America, which was one of my other, prideful moments in my career. So I think how you tell your story from a business sense and talk about presenteeism, you talk about turnover, and as you talk to leaders, if you can also bring in one of the site directors or leaders or VPs that saw you in action, and they can tell the story of an incident or an event. Travel security crisis events are also stories that person stuck in an earthquake or a hurricane or in a bombing. They'll tell the story of how security went and took care of them. Let them be your promoters. But on that site leader, if you can get him or her to talk about your value to them and how it doesn't help you, you don't make and sell stuff, but you provide that the safety, that's more EH&S, getting run over by a forklift or getting hazardous chemicals on your hand. Safe and secure, we're the security perspective from internal risks, the bullies, the workplace violence threats, or external threats, people trying to break into their cars, which is extremely important to folks, where their cars is probably their most valued asset that they have. So if you can influence those site leaders and have advocates, and more, even better yet, if you can turn those naysayers into advocates, they're going to tell an amazing story, and they're going to build your brand and build the security culture along with you. I don't know if I answered your question, Jon. I'm sorry if I didn't.
No, I think you did, and that paints a very important picture, and it stitches together a number of other podcasts that we've sort of had on industrial psychology, and of course, as I mentioned, staying level on the job whilst something else is going on. Obviously, we could explore future areas, right? Future areas that would love to get into, maybe not on this session, but with you, definitely could be investigative skills, that gaining trust, but with great power comes great responsibility, because someone opens up. Why are you getting them to open up, and how can that be beneficial? I think that could be an extra area to investigate. As well as Jon mentioned, the balance between who makes culture, top down, bottom up, organic. It just is. It isn't. Lots of esoteric questions we could ask as well. But I think this and of course mental health, which is front of mind. Lots of statistics coming out, even here in the UK, news coming out, and I cannot purport to be an expert in mental health. And of course, if you are affected by any of these topics, you must find professional guidance. But I really think this is a great look, and in your career, it's great. It's not only a great topic, but it's great to have you having worked for some of the largest companies, including Kimberly Clark, including Cardinal, and GM and other companies, which I think has added to the flavor.
Yeah. And just to go back to John's question about what would you tell the important guidance to folks anywhere in their career, again, seek wisdom on how to build the security culture. And it includes psychology, philosophy, neuroscience, business, understanding timing, how to communicate, how to be precise and concise. How are you going to speak to that third shift forklift driver versus the site director or a VP? And just be careful to not get into an echo chamber and stay within groups that you feel comfortable with. And maybe they have good guidance, but there's always more. I think there's always more to learn from other folks. Like I said, I don't know it all, but I would put my 40 years on with, I'm a generalist. I've done investigations, travel security, supply chain security, SecTech, training, EP. I've traveled with CEOs on the corporate jet. I've done the EP plans, the advanced work, all that stuff in my career. So I would tell the folks, learn about culture, understand it, and never stop seeking that wisdom. And we all have cultures, to Fallon's point, we're all in corporate and living in a culture, in a corporate culture or security culture. You just don't know how to define it, and you don't know where you are on that spectrum. Is it a good culture? Is it good sometimes, or is it bad? Some companies have the best vision and mission statements on the wall, but they're just words. People don't care. It's every day, every interaction, consistency of how the site leaders treat their employees. I'd say site leaders more than anything. We work for supervisors. We don't work for a company. We work for our first supervisor or our first manager. The company has the paycheck name on it, right? The company pays you. But really I think a missing gap are the leads. It's generally an employee and maybe a team lead and the supervisor, assistant manager, and so forth. But really, an area where security can engage more is working with the site leader, the senior leader, and say, let me talk to your frontline supervisors as a subgroup and talk about indicators of bullying and microaggressions. And maybe they're doing some of those things on their own, right? Cutting people off, for example, from speaking. If you say, I really want to hear what you have to say in a pre-shift huddle or in a team meeting, and if you don't give them the time of day, if you're looking at your phone, if you cut them off, those are aggression or microaggression.
Just
great.
Aggression. It's just aggression, isn't it?
Just
like
aggression,
what I'm doing now to you, it's aggression.
Yeah, and that person and everybody is looking at that person, and it's intuitive, and that erodes the trust. People are going to do. Some people might do the minimum to get by and get their paycheck, but really, the best companies are the ones that have those open, trusting, vulnerable teams where leaders can laugh at themselves and leaders know a little bit about other people's lives, not in depth, but at least a little bit, to where they can talk, say, hey, how's your son's football game? I'm sorry, not soccer, right? Or how's the baseball game? Engage over time, develop that rapport. I think those are the key things. But I talk about security as two parts. There's the art and the science. The science is your security technology. Your camera works or doesn't work. It's still complex and very extensive. Kind of the current risk right now in security technology is lead time. Some of the people I work with are saying, before, if a badge reader was out, it was a 2-week lead time. Now with supply chain, it's 2 years. So, and that's just one part. I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Give me another question.
But I think this tees up a future session with you, which of course, is presumptive on my part. I'd love to invite you back.
Sure. Anytime. I'd love to join you guys, and I hope I answered your questions, and I hope I tied things together as I went on, but there's a lot of things I can share, and I'm glad to help anybody. If anybody wants to talk, just to bounce stuff off, I'll do it at no cost, because I think that's part of being compassionate, to help somebody. And I just love helping folks.
That's very generous. Thank you, Jon. I think we'll have to just call this part one for sure. So much more to unpack on this topic.
Absolutely. So, Jon, thank you very much. Obviously, a lot of colleagues in the States will already know you, but it's great as well to introduce you to some of our protector audiences worldwide. Not that we know that we've got a lot of US protectors as well listening, so that's always a plus. But Jon, from Jon and myself, we've been very lucky to have you on. Thank you very much. And so this has been a great look at workplace culture and mental health for the Circuit Magazine podcast. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Jon Rodriguez, for joining us. What a career to hear about, and also what an important sentiment to get ready for the industry. And as we said with Jon Moss, there is definitely another episode needed to uncover more. But I'm back with Shaun West. Shaun, how was today's session for you?
I thought it was fantastic. The two great subjects to be looking at: security culture, mental well-being, and it's something that's not looked at as much as it should be, maybe. I thought Jon's case studies were very interesting when, dealing with staff or HR departments, that, sometimes you can still deliver a harsh message, but it can be delivered in an empathetic way. I think, as we alluded to in the intro, you talked about bringing, someone into an organization who's going to, bring a new person in who's coming in as a head of security or director of security, and to try and build that security culture. There's different ways to. You've got to break a lot of eggs to make an omelette, and I've had experience of that where we've worked with people who've came in and straight away they've come in and they've said, right, we need to get rid of this person, this person, this person, get rid of this facet of security. Lots of different ways you can do it, and I guess there's no right way, there's no wrong way, because getting rid of dead wood can sometimes professionalize a department, and at the same time you might have people who are working within the department, but they aren't feeling loved. So it depends on the kind of manager you're bringing in. But so there's different ways to harness the culture. And I've had experience of all that, and I see myself as kind of the middle of the two, if I'm honest. You have to be firm with the message you're giving out. You're in a professional workplace, so you're getting paid to provide a service. You need to provide that service, and if you don't provide that service, then you can be moved on. But at the same time, when you're working for a big organization or even a smaller company, you have to make these people feel valued to get the most out of them. So, it's really interesting. Some of the messages he said, that you can, hit something with a sledgehammer, but you can deliver it in an empathetic way, where the remainder of the team understand why it's getting done and they feel loved also, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and especially now when people are at least in the tech sector, having a hard time, there's people left behind, there's people who are let go. And yeah, you can deliver a harsh message in a much more empathetic way. And that gels with, of course, our friends who've been, at least one of them has been on the podcast, Lee Orton, as well as Tim Wenzel, who do the kindness games. It's advocating for a more empathetic culture. So there's a lot of synergy there. And particularly in the run up to the festive season, there's a lot of people for whom this may not be the most amazing season because of whatever circumstance, and you can be empathetic to that and reach out to them. So that's why I like combining security culture and mental well-being as a topic, which is really good. But coming up next week, we have the EP Forum and the IPSB in Vegas. I will be there, and I know Elijah will be there for at least part of it. So we definitely want anyone listening to come and say hello if you're there, because we know that there's not just colleagues from the States, there's colleagues from Germany, France, UK. I'm pretty sure from South Africa, Mexico, absolutely. And I think a couple from Australia have reached out and said they're going to be there, as well as even a colleague from Ibiza. So I very much want to see you there, and I want you to, make yourself known, and we can have a great conversation. In terms of the magazine, what have we got coming up, Shaun? What have we got to ask people about?
Yeah, we've just got the latest issue of the magazine coming up, as well as future issues of the podcast, and the message we always put out there. We're looking for writers, people who are interested in coming on the podcast and supporting what we're trying to put out there. Without you, we couldn't make this happen. So please, if you're interested in writing an article, getting your name out there, please get in touch.
Love it. And yes, please keep commenting and keep up the good work on the BBA Connect app and the NABA Protector app as well. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of the community next week. And I very much appreciate Jon Rodriguez for coming on today. Obviously, big cheese as it were, big ASIS friend, big friend of the corporate security industry. So yeah, I really enjoyed that, and it was great that Jon and I got to catch up with him. So from Shaun West and myself, this has been another fantastic edition of the Circuit Magazine podcast.
You have been listening to the Circuit Magazine podcast. Be sure to subscribe and be sure to not miss an episode.